most of what we're going to be seeing today will be from the student view. So I'm going to pull that up here. Let's start with everybody's favorite, which is word problems. So when we think about word problems, we know that students really don't like word problems, for lack of a better phrase. And a lot of that has to do with how they're presented. So if you look at this sample of 3 questions that I have here, these are 3 word problems that all require linear equations to solve. And you can see that there's really no scaffolding built in whatsoever. All you see here is that there's a question that's being asked and then an answer blank. There's no learning tools. There's no steps involved. It's just question and answer. So if you're around my age, you probably remember doing questions like this out of a textbook when you were in high school and college, right? Here's a question, answer it. Students nowadays who read questions like this often get discouraged. They don't even really know how to do these types of problems. And when they see that there's no learning tools for them, they often just skip the problem entirely, or they try to find a separate way of answering it without actually doing the work. So at the question level, one thing we're going to try to promote in this presentation is this idea of scaffolding. And there's a number of different ways we can do this. I'm going to show you one way right now, but I'm going to get into some other examples later on. So this is not just the only way. Here are those same 3 questions, but they're presented a little bit differently, okay? You can see that there's no answer blank. What there is a link to click to begin, right? So for example, in the first example here with a taxi cab company figuring out the how many miles it was based on the dollar amounts, the first thing this is going to do when the student clicks on this is it's actually going to talk to them about the structure of the problem. So instead of just diving right in and trying to find the solution, we're going to talk about, well, what does it mean to calculate the cost of the trip? We define what our variable means. We try to figure out how that variable is attached to the 2 pieces of information, which is the flat fee and then the cost per mile, and how that then incorporates itself to create the cost of the trip. So this immediately gets the student thinking from a conceptual point of view rather than just diving in and figuring out how to solve this. So we're going to pick the first one here and submit that, right? Because it's the flat fee plus the cost per mile times the number of miles. And now it brings us on to the next step, which is constructing the equation. So taking the answer from the previous step and using that to build an equation with the known information, and so on and so forth. So it takes the students through step by step. This is really going to help them, close those gaps and encourage them to solve the problem, even if they're not really sure how to start it, because the problem helps them get started. Another thing it does, and this is one of the side benefits, is it reintroduces them to fundamental vocabulary, right? So a lot of developmental math is loaded with vocabulary, and the way that the questions were asked earlier really had nothing, didn't introduce that vocabulary at all. But in these types of problems, it will remind the student, for example, here, it talks about, what labor hours are, what the set cost or the flat fee is. It reminds them what it means to define a variable, which is something that our students rarely do when they're solving application problems. And as many of you know, that's usually the first thing they should be doing, is identifying the thing that they're solving for. These come from that built-in tutorial bank that Jennifer was talking about earlier, that is provided free of charge from WebAssign. Before we move on to the modules section, I do want to show you where some of these are located. Whenever you create an assignment in the assignment editor, go to the question browser here. So here are all the textbooks that I have. And below that is, this is one of the tutorial banks. This is one of the many tutorial banks that Jennifer mentioned earlier. This is one of my favorite ones, this Introductory and Intermediate Algebra, because it has 21 chapters, everything ranging from pre-algebra arithmetic all the way up to pre-calculus concepts like transcendental functions, conic sections, and so on. All of the questions in these tutorial banks come in two versions, right? So for example, if I go to the factoring one, I'll just show you from the beginning here. So every single question has two versions. So this first version, the tutorial is optional. And the second version, the tutorial is mandatory. So again, you have that flexibility as the instructor to decide which type you want. These choices are also available in many of the textbooks. Here's the Alfman textbook that I was using. If I go into 8.1, which is common factors, here's an example here. All right, so you can see that this is question 16, right? And it has this MI suffix. And this is also question 16, and this one has an MISA suffix. So what do those mean? So MI means master it, and that's the example I showed you earlier where the tutorial is optional. So if you chose this question with the MI, the tutorial would be optional as a button for the student to click on. If, on the other hand, you chose this MISA, then you would be requiring the tutorial, okay? And these questions are scattered throughout the text. I'll switch from the full view to the micro view just to show you here. This is just that one particular chapter. So you can see here, here's all of the questions, and all of the ones that say MI are those masterists, and they are always immediately followed by an MISA, which is the standalone. I showed you the tutorial bank. And then just one last thing I wanted to show you is these CC problems. This is something I discovered recently because it was added recently. I used these a lot after the transition in March to online learning. Questions like this here, and it only shows the first part, but each of these actually has 3 parts to it. Each of these questions has a video that the students can watch, and then they solve a problem. So again, this is, you know, for all those visual learners out there, if they don't like reading text or they have, you know, difficulty when that is presented to them, you can also have these visual problems with videos as an option as well.